Don't tell me this ain't no Christmas movie.
Merry Christmas from Mrs. Whiskers!
And Merry Christmas from Madam Matinee, darling.
Merry Christmas, y'all. I'm excited. I'm going to review one of my favorite Christmas movies, Gremlins. Only good things can come from small packages, right?
Raw!
Mr. Flickster.
Hello, world. It's Mr. Flickster, and I just love talking motion pictures. As you can see, it's a wonderfully white Christmas. So, the horror comedy Gremlins came out in 1984. It was directed by Joe Dante and written by Chris Columbus.
This is going to be a spoiler review. So if you haven't seen Gremlins by now, you've been warned.
It's the story of how an inventor buys a peculiar pet at a store in Chinatown. It's a Christmas present for his son. The instructions for what's called a Mogwai are very simple, but they must be strictly adhered to. There's 3 rules. You never get them wet. You never expose them to any light, especially sunlight, because that's fatal. And finally, you never, ever, ever feed them after midnight. I know, there's a lot of questions, but I'll touch on that later.
Oh, please, darling, we all know cats rule.
I'm feline, your style!
I love the way that Joe Dante uses several camera tricks to hide the limitations of the animatronics and the puppetry at the time. Because think about it, this was the mid-80s, so there was a lot of limitations for what you could do. So he uses, when you're looking at the Gremlins, for example, from the Mogwai perspective, you're down looking up at it, giving it like a forced perspective. And then, similarly, when you're the Gremlins, you're looking down onto Gizmo. So again, it's the opposite, and I like how they do that. There's a lot of opposites in this, and there's a good dichotomy of both the Gremlins and the Mogwais, but I'll get into that too.
I've heard Steven Spielberg recommended Joe Dante after seeing The Howling. So, that actually makes a lot of sense.
I think it was a good choice because there's a very harmonious blend here of both horror and humor. So, here's a little information about Chris Columbus. He's opened up several times about how much he loves Christmas and his fondness for that holiday in a bunch of different interviews. He's also said that at the time, he was really, really poor, and he could hear the mice scratching around inside the walls, the little scratches. He said at night he could even feel the mice crawling on him, which really creeped him out. And that also inspired him to write this script.
They say in the original script, Stripe was supposed to be the gift to Billy. There was no Gizmo, and it was supposed to be rated R. Can you imagine an R-rated Gremlins?
But the final draft is the masterpiece that we got today. They say Steven Spielberg is the one who had the idea that one Mogwai be good in order to better resonate with the audience. Good call. Now, as for the plot holes for the 3 rules, because I know what you're thinking.
You wouldn't believe how many cats follow their own rules.
Do you want to hear my Gizmo impression? Bright lights! Bright lights!
Okay, so the bright light thing is kind of self-explanatory. And for the most part, they do kind of follow that rule. Except for the one part when the gremlin in the school goes to the vent, and you can clearly see that it's in the sunlight. So maybe he just got burned a little bit, like when a vampire runs through a little ray of sunlight, but that's the only really inconsistency I can think of. As far as the other ones go, like getting wet, for example, The Gremlins are seen several times in the snow, and they seem to have no effect on them. Also, they're seen drinking beer inside the bar, and they pour the beer on top of each other, and that also has no effect on them. Also, I've always wondered, what about crying? Or like when they have to pee? Isn't that gonna get them wet somehow? And then the final one, how long after midnight do you have to wait? Because that's pretty vague if you ask me. So do you have to wait till like dawn? Do you have to wait until like noon the next day? Like, does it have to be 12 hours? Just something I wonder about. How about you? What do you think? Leave comments down below about any other inconsistencies in the rules or any ways that the movie breaks its own rules. Like the light in the movie theater. How are they watching a movie with that bright projection light? Something to think about, eh? So, the special effects were done by Chris Wallace. So he designed a lot of the looks for a lot of the different creatures. And I'm sorry, but I'm always a fan of puppetry and animatronics over CGI because there's some things you just can't do with CGI, you know what I mean? Like, you can't mimic a lot of the textures, like the way the hair looks on the Mogwais, the way that the scales look on the Gremlins, but even how expressive they make the different faces. You can tell just what Gizmo's thinking without even him saying a word. Just like, you know, what Stripe is thinking just by the way he looks at different things, like the candy, or the way he looks at Mrs. Deagle's place. They're just very expressive, especially when after the water falls on top of Gizmo in the beginning and the first set of Mogwais get set out. They pop out of his back. You can tell exactly what he's thinking with this image right here. Look at that face. Oh, poor Gizmo. I love the very strategic things that are done to hide the limitations of the puppetry and the animatronics. For example, like when Gizmo was strategically placed inside of Billy's backpack when he's walking around, because it was really hard at the time to make animatronics walk, just like they had to know how to use longer arms for the Gremlins. So it'll be easier to use the puppet rods. That's why the Gremlins have short legs too, because it's a little bit easier to make them walk with shorter legs. Still very difficult though.
They say 8 to 10 people controlled each puppet.
But each Gremlin is just bursting with personality, which you can see in the movie theater and the bar scene. These are both great examples of their oddly cartoonish behavior, but each one is just so charismatic and has so much personality that you can't help but laugh at them, even though they want to kill you. There's a lot of folklore from Great Britain about how planes were being tampered with by these Gremlins, and they would cause a lot of crashes at the time. They even referenced it in the Twilight Zone. That's why in this movie you see them messing with like the stoplight, for example. You also see them in the kitchen tinkering with stuff. You see them, they mess with the electricity in the house, like with the alarm clock, for example. That's before they even become Gremlins. Then you see them tinkering with like the projector. In the bar, they're all tinkering with different things. Then they learn how to use guns. They're very mechanically inclined, and it's cool how they use that in this. They also use a lot of amazing stop motion and hand-drawn animation, which I thought is one of those small details, but it's a nice touch. Deck the halls, that's a warning from the elves. What's that? You're right, something's going on with my camera. Oh no. It can't be, can it? Flexter. Mr. Flexter. 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 Flexter, Flexter. Flexter. Flexter, 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 Flexter. Flexter, 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 Flexter. Flexter, Flexter. Flexter. Flexter, 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 Flexter. Flexter, Flexter. Deagle. I think that everyone in the cast does a good job of filling their roles. Zach Gilligan is Billy Peltzer. He's a young bank teller and he's an artist. But you can tell that there's a lot behind that. Like he's aspiring to be more, kind of like he wants to get out of this small town because he's a big dreamer. This is reflected in his artwork. Like when he draws his boss, Mrs. Deagle, as a dragon. He's very imaginative that way. Digga, 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 digga. Phoebe Cates is Kate Berenger. She has a tragic backstory involving her father and Christmas and chimneys, which seems kind of out of nowhere, but it also kind of fits with this balance they have between humor and this darker tone. But there's no denying, this is totally a Christmas movie. It takes place on Christmas Eve. Gizmo is a Christmas present. The Gremlins dress up as carolers at one point, and they're singing around. There's a lot of Christmas iconography all over the place, even after that first scene in Chinatown, which seems like it has nothing to do with Christmas at all, but set up that dark tone instead. Then it transitions, and it plays Christmas music, and they show the whole town. It's decorated in all this holiday stuff. It's very Christmassy. Don't tell me this ain't no Christmas movie. Hoyt Axton is Randall Peltzer. He's Billy's father, and he's the inventor, and he's the narrator, who we're introduced to right off the bat in the beginning of the film. Frances Lee McCain is Lynn Peltzer, his wife, Billy's mom, but she's no damsel in distress. One of my favorite scenes, and the one that scared the hell out of me when I was a kid, is that kitchen scene, right after the Gremlins in the attic hatch. Polly Holiday is Ruby Deagle. Deagle, 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 Deagle. She has got to be one of the most evil movie villains ever created. What kind of person wants to kill a dog? Like, that's awful. What did that poor dog ever do to her?
As much as I hate doggies, I wouldn't wish death on one. And he lives in this horror film. Hooray!
Honestly, darling, Mogwai? More like a dog? Why?
Dick Miller is Murray Futterman. He's the veteran who's knowledgeable of the Gremlins. He's the one who tries to tell everyone. But of course, nobody listens. It's funny how the person who seems to be crazy usually tends to be right in these kinds of movies.
I love how they both use and depict actual folklore from Great Britain about gremlins in this film.
Jackie Joseph is Sheila Futterman, his wife. Judge Reinhold plays Gerald Hopkins. He's got a very small role in this. Glenn Turman is Roy Hansen, the biology teacher. He takes a Mogwai from Billy early on in the movie, and he actually turns out to be one of his first victims. Kie Luke is Mr. Wayne. I'm sorry if I butchered that. He's the merchant who owns Gizmo, who's reluctant to sell him. Explains the rules and how much of a responsibility it is in the beginning to take care of a Mogwai. And last but not least is the always lovable Corey Feldman as Pete Fontaine, Billy's friend. Fun fact, this film came out the same year as Friday the 13th, the final chapter. He's the one that actually spills the water, if I'm not mistaken. They all bring the characters to life with so much charisma and chemistry, and they actually feel like people who have known each other for a while, who grew up in this small town together. And the whole town itself, it feels so lived in. There's just so much atmosphere. I don't know, this movie's just so Christmas, if you ask me. It always reminds me of Christmas. I can't think of Christmas and not think of Gremlins. Even though it came out in the summer. Nowhere near Christmas. But hey, Hollywood's funny, isn't it? Don't tell me this ain't no Christmas movie.
And that iconic score by Jerry Goldsmith is going to be burned in my brain forever.
So, overall, this movie is so emotionally moving, but it's terrifying too. And I always thought that dichotomy was very interesting. It made me laugh, but it also scared me too. I was always weirdly drawn to it that way. Oh, the joys of being a 90s kid. I love how the film starts out one way, but then slowly progresses into a full-fledged creature feature about midway through. It's done so with that classic bait-and-switch method that Steven Spielberg is oh too well known for. And I mean that as a compliment. I have nothing bad to say about Steven Spielberg. He's my favorite director, after all. He's the reason I love cinema. Prefers to show us the bright side by showing Gizmo the Mogwai, and then it shows the dark side by showing Stripe the Gremlin. Existentially, in a way, the Gremlins represent chaotic evil, and then the Mogwais represent chaotic good. Kind of that good stress and bad stress kind of idea. A little bit of stress is healthy for you, but when you get too much, it can be very, very bad. There's a lot of dark sides to that. Not just chaos. This movie also touches on the themes of capitalism and commercialism. And yeah, a lot of people say this can be seen as like a 90-minute toy commercial. I mean, come on. Even the finale takes place in a toy store. I mean, they're not even subtle about it. However, it's a very poignant, yet scary, yet hilarious story set on Christmas Eve. And technically, if you think about it, once it goes after midnight, it would be Christmas Day. All this put together just shows how much thought and care was put into this film. As for me personally, I can't remember a time in my life where I wasn't really watching this movie. Sure, I could only watch bits and pieces of it, and then I'd run away screaming. But eventually I did get to the point where I was able to watch the whole thing, and now over the years I've watched it so many times. It's just one of those comfort movies, you know what I mean? It reminds me of Christmas. It reminds me of like my younger days being in the 90s. It reminds me of when I used to live in California. Because I remember a time when I was a kid, I was walking in the WB store, and I was going around the corner, and all of a sudden I became face to face with Stripe, and it scared the hell out of me. I screamed, I ran, everything. But yeah, basically what I'm saying is I love this movie because of the ingenious directing, very innovative imagery with the puppets and the animatronics. I really like the acting. Like, you really get attached to each character. Each performance is just so engaging, and you really do care about all these characters, especially when the bodies start piling up. You really feel the sense of danger until the characters find a way out of this mess, which of course is when they realize sunlight is actually lethal. And that image of Stripe melting in the fountain is always going to haunt me. I don't know about you. Same with my favorite scene, the microwave scene in the kitchen. That's got to be one of the best scenes. I also love the really inventive writing by Chris Columbus. He knows how to tell a story.
Steven Spielberg was an executive producer for the film, and it was made by his production company, Amblin Entertainment.
Gizmo is the cutest movie monster ever created. The Mogwai is voiced by Howie Mandel. Legendary voice actor Frank Welker is perfect as Stripe, the main antagonist of the film, which they say also suggested Howie Mandel to play Gizmo in the first place. You can tell he's got kind of a Bobby's World kind of sound to him after a few times of watching that movie and growing up on Bobby's World. So, this film was made on a budget of $11 million. It ended up making over $200 million at the box office, spawning one sequel and several ripoffs, like these.
They say it was allegedly the objections against the final cut of this film and Indiana Jones' Temple of Doom that inspired Steven Spielberg to suggest to the MPAA to create a new rating in between the movie ratings PG and R. So this film and Steven Spielberg are partially responsible for the PG-13 rating. Talk about a gift.
So, my first grade for this is extra, extra, extra large popcorn. And an extra large hot cocoa.
Why did the Mogwai cross the street? Too wet on the other side. Happy New Year.
Stay tuned for season 2, darling. Honestly, you won't want to miss it. Unlike my sister's powerful puns.
And remember, you better watch out. There might be a gremlin in your house.
In case you haven't heard, I'm a film critic on HorrorBuzz.com. And I make frequent appearances on HorrorBuzz Live, their YouTube channel. I'll make sure to put links below for that.
Until next time, I'm Mr. Flickster.
Mr. Flickster.